Okay, my name is Kieran Summer, and I will be summarizing the research article called The Tip of the Tongue Heuristic: How Tip of the Tongue States Confer Perceptibility on Inaccessible Words. So, the tip of the tongue phenomenon is when someone is unable to remember a certain topic, phrase, or word, but they are very close to remembering it. This topic interests me because I oftentimes encounter this problem within my memory, and it fascinates me where I can remember something that is like second nature and I've studied for so long, but I just cannot for the life of me explain what it is or what the phenomenon is even called. This particular phenomenon is heavily connected to how we retrieve information from memory. So, being able to research, understand, and share with the world what we find as researchers is crucial because, like many ideas in psychology, this information is for the betterment of society. It has a relation to cognitive psychology with just the terms of dealing with memory, and its relation to society is simply to better ourselves, to understand our memory more than we already know. So the article starts out by talking about previous knowledge and studies done about this phenomenon and all the relations to it. The introduction explains the description of the definition of tip of the tongue, or TOT for short. The point of the study is the exact reverse. Whether people have attributed having the TOT phenomenon to certain word characteristics instead of word characteristics being attributed to the TOT phenomenon. Previous research has shown that TOT states cause people to say that the words were studied when they have not been retrieved from their memory at all. This explanation was an incidental explanation due to a previous study included in the article. This present study, which the article goes into and actually explains, talks about how the TOT state may be the cause of inferring studied words instead of previous knowledge. The researchers stated that their hypothesis is that during a TOT state, individuals will have an increased likelihood of attributes to the unretrieved word. They go into experiment 1A, experiment 1B, and experiment 2, which deal with certain characteristics of the TOT phenomenon. I will now be going into and explaining the first experiment in this article that was described. This first experiment had parts A and parts B that were very, very similar to each other. This first part A, had the researchers come up with a hypothesis, which was that the participants were more likely to judge a word as appeared before in a darker, clearer font in a tip of the tongue state than not in a tip of the tongue state. This was done at Colorado State University with 40 undergraduate students. This part of the experiment had 20 dark font words and 20 light font words. And after these were flashed towards them, they were asked questions of whether they saw the word or not and what shade it was. An additional question was made to ask them if they feel the tip of the tongue phenomenon while answering these questions. For the results of this part of the study, participants thought it was more likely that an unretrieved word was clear upon last reading it than when in a tip of the tongue state than for it when they were not. So for the second part of the study, experiment 1B, the hypothesis that the researchers came up with was that they were more likely to judge a word as appeared before in a larger font in a tip of the tongue state. This was also done at Colorado State University with 56 undergraduate students. So this part of the study used 20 words in 48-point font and 20 words in 18-point font. And this was the same procedure. They were then asked questions after they saw the words flashing at them, and the results of this part of the study was that participants thought it was more likely that an unretrieved word was larger upon last reading it when in a tip of the tongue state for that than when they were not in a tip of the tongue state. So these two graphs are from the article itself, and these two graphs basically represent what the participants were feeling when they were in the tip of the tongue state when they were in the non-tip of the tongue state. And as you can see from these graphs, there is more clarity when they were in the tip of the tongue state, which means that they had remembered and they felt like they knew those words, even though some of them may not have been shown. The second half of this this article dealt with experiment 2, which was similar to experiment 1, but this was different in they were dealing with word frequency. And the researchers came up with a hypothesis that word frequency will be higher while in a tip of the tongue state than not in a tip of the tongue state. The study had 40 Colorado State University undergraduate students. They used about 40 different words by flashing all these different words at the participants. At the end of this study, there was evidence of a tip of the tongue heuristic after analyzing all of the questions. There was indication of a greater likelihood that the unretrieved target word that they were asking was a higher frequency word, even though this wasn't so at all. A tip of the tongue state was an indicator for a heightened sense of accessibility for the unretrieved target word than compared to a non-tip of the tongue state. This is the graph from that article that talked about how experiment 2 showed that the tip of the tongue state was higher and more frequent with the target studied and the target non-studied. It was really similar across the board, but as you can see, there is more frequency when there is a tip of the tongue state than while not in a tip of the tongue state. After reading the article, I kind of went back and I researched, or I thought about more in depth about this article. And I thought about how the results are important because they show us that people have an assumption to think that they saw retrieved words because of their memory, but in reality, it's because of the tip of the tongue phenomenon. This reaction could help us and the psychological field in the future figure out how we can manipulate memory to retrieve words better. I found the problems of this theory or experiment is that it only centered in a college community where people are constantly learning. But if this was put out in public and tested on the average person and not in the weird population, we might be able to find a difference between the two. I found limitations of this article were that the experiences that different individuals have are very different and are based on interpretation of what the tip of the tongue phenomenon is in their mind. This is relying on self-reporting, which is in varying degrees. But I feel like if we get more knowledge and more data about this phenomenon, we can be able to understand it better and possibly use it to our advantage in the future. I feel like there are huge real world implications with the tip of the tongue phenomenon in the terms of, in this study, is to put it in technology to develop a way we can utilize the tip of the tongue phenomenon to our advantage, whether it's through using an app to manipulate our tip of the tongue phenomenon so we can retrieve that information or retrieve correct information. With memory, we can use it by looking back in our past and retrieving information that's not able to be readily accessible. So by using the tip of the tongue phenomenon, we can retrieve that information better. And lastly, this study also tells us that the mind can imagine information, which means more research needs to be done on the correct use of memory and possibly using the tip of the tongue phenomenon as a way to disregard some false memories that were manifested, because this is just it's a negative thing in emotion that we oftentimes fill in. So thank you for listening and tuning in to my analysis and summary of the tip of the tongue heuristic and how it can confer perceptibility on inaccessible words. Thank you, and go Griffs.